marble floor, silencing the entire ballroom. Adelaide Whitmore's perfectly manicured hand still hung in the air where she'd knocked it from Elijah's grasp. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the commotion. Smartphones emerged from designer clutches like fireflies in the darkness, their cameras already recording. "How dare you?" Adelaide hissed, her ice blue eyes blazing with contempt. "How dare you walk into my home dressed like that, pretending you belong here?" 17-year-old Elijah Reeves stood frozen, champagne dripping from his worn dress shoes. The vintage navy suit his grandmother had given him, his late grandfather's suit, suddenly felt heavier, more obviously outdated. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket, but he kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, I was invited." "I don't care what you think you have," Adelaide cut him off, stepping closer. The emerald silk of her evening gown rustled like a snake's warning. Her diamond necklace caught the chandelier light, throwing fractured rainbows across her pale face. "This is a private event for distinguished guests, not for teenagers who clearly can't even afford a proper suit." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Elijah felt heat crawling up his neck, but something his grandmother Rosetta had said that morning echoed in his mind. "Hold your head high, baby. You got every right to be there. More than you know." "Please," Elijah said quietly, finally extracting the cream-colored invitation from his pocket. "Just look at this." Adelaide snatched it from his hand so violently that the expensive paper nearly tore. Her eyes scanned it for perhaps 2 seconds before she let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "This is clearly a mistake. Or a forgery." She crumpled it in her fist. James, where is security?" A tall man in a black suit emerged from the crowd. James Kensington, head of security, had kind eyes that looked troubled as they fell on Elijah. "Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we should." "Remove this boy immediately," Adelaide commanded, her voice rising to ensure everyone could hear. "Before he steals something or embarrasses himself further." "That's a bit harsh, Adelaide," a woman's voice called out. Lila Hartwell, dressed in a modest blue gown, pushed through the crowd. "He's just a kid. Maybe we should verify." "Stay out of this, Lila," Adelaide snapped. "This is my home. I decide who stays and who goes." But it wasn't her home. Not really. And in about 60 seconds, Adelaide Whitmore's entire world was about to collapse. Elijah had woken that morning in the small 2-bedroom apartment he shared with his grandmother in the modest neighborhood of Riverside. The sunrise barely penetrated the thin curtains, casting weak light across his room's worn carpet and second-hand furniture. He'd worked the closing shift at Morrison's grocery the night before, his legs still aching from 8 hours of stocking shelves and carrying bags to customers' cars. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier. Thick, expensive paper with gold embossed lettering that seemed to glow. "Mr. Elijah Reeves, guest of honor, Bennett Foundation Gala at Whitmore Estate." He'd read it 20 times, certain there was a mistake. "There's no mistake, baby," Rosetta had said, her warm brown eyes twinkling behind her gold-rimmed glasses as she pressed her late husband's suit into Elijah's hands. "Your great-grandfather Isaiah, he wanted you to see this. To know where you came from." "But Grandma, I don't understand. Why would I be invited to something like this? We don't know any of these people." Rosetta had smiled, that mysterious smile she got when she knew something important but wasn't ready to share it. "Some things you need to discover for yourself. You go to that gala, Elijah. You walk in there with your head high, you hear me? You got every right." Now, standing in the Whitmore Estate's grand ballroom with Adelaide Whitmore looking at him like he was something she'd scraped off her designer shoe, Elijah wondered if his grandmother had been wrong. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should just leave. James Kensington moved toward him, apologetic but dutiful. "Son, I'm going to have to ask you to stop." The voice cracked through the ballroom like thunder. An elderly man with wispy white hair burst through the crowd, his worn leather briefcase swinging wildly. Horace Pemberton looked every one of his 82 years as he rushed forward, his black 3-piece suit slightly rumpled, his thick-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose. "Do not touch that young man," Horace gasped, slightly out of breath. "Mrs. Whitmore, step away from him immediately." Adelaide's perfectly composed face twisted with annoyance. Pemberton, I'm handling a situation here. Take your paperwork obsession and— That paperwork, Horace interrupted, his voice suddenly steel, is the deed to this estate. And I suggest you review it very carefully before you make an even bigger fool of yourself than you already have. The ballroom went silent. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. 200 wealthy guests leaned forward, sensing drama better than any scripted television show. Adelaide's laugh was sharp and brittle. Have you gone senile, old man? This is the Whitmore estate. It's been in my late husband's family for 70 years. I don't need to review anything. Actually, Horace said, setting his briefcase on a nearby table and clicking it open, you really do. He pulled out a stack of yellow documents, official seals still visible on the aged paper. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to the true owner of this estate. Or rather, the descendant of the true owner. Horace turned to Elijah, his gray eyes warm with something like pride. Young man, what's your full name? Elijah's voice came out barely above a whisper. Elijah Isaiah Reeves, sir. And your great-grandfather's name? Isaiah Reeves. Horace smiled and held up the first document, turning it so the crowd could see the faded but still legible writing. In 1954, Isaiah Reeves purchased this estate for $43,000 when the original Whitmore family faced bankruptcy. He saved them from losing everything. Adelaide's face had gone from flushed with anger to pale with confusion. That's not possible. My husband never mentioned. Your husband probably never knew, Horace said gently. His grandfather kept it quiet. You see, Isaiah Reeves was a brilliant businessman, an entrepreneur who'd built a small fortune through hard work and shrewd investments. But 1954 was a different time. A black man owning a grand estate like this would have faced difficulties. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. So Isaiah made an arrangement with Thomas Whitmore Sr., Horace continued. He would hold the deed, maintain legal ownership, but allow the Whitmore family to continue living here. He wanted to help them, not displace them. It was an act of extraordinary generosity. Cordelia Westbrook, Adelaide's closest friend, spoke up from the crowd. But surely after 70 years, ownership would have transferred. Surely. Ownership was maintained through a family trust, Horace explained, pulling out another document. Isaiah died young, tragically. But his daughter, Rosetta Reeves, honored her father's wishes. She let the Whitmores stay, asked for nothing in return. For 70 years, the Reeves family has owned this estate, and for 70 years, they've let your family live here out of pure kindness. Adelaide swayed slightly, gripping a nearby chair. No, Thomas would have told me. He would have. Your husband probably didn't know, Horace repeated. His grandfather kept it quiet, and apparently, so did his father. But 3 months ago, when Thomas passed, the trust required notification. I sent you the documents weeks ago, Mrs. Whitmore. You ignored them. Elijah felt like the floor was tilting beneath him. His grandmother had known. All along, she'd known. And she'd sent him here not just to attend a gala, but to claim his heritage. This is why, Horace said, holding up the crumpled invitation Adelaide had thrown down, Elijah Reeves was the guest of honor tonight. This gala was organized by the Bennett Foundation to honor Isaiah Reeves's legacy of generosity and community service. Elijah was meant to give the keynote speech about continuing his great-grandfather's work. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Then someone started recording again, then another, then another. Within seconds, dozens of phones were capturing Adelaide's expression as the truth crashed down around her. Natasha Chin, a journalist for the Metro Herald, pushed to the front. Mrs. Whitmore, would you care to comment on how you just tried to forcibly remove the actual owner of this estate? Adelaide's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Mascara had started to run down her cheeks, leaving dark tracks against her pale skin. The perfect updo she'd spent 2 hours creating was coming undone, strands of platinum blonde hair falling around her face. I didn't. He looked. She gestured weakly at Elijah's outdated suit, his worn shoes. He looked poor, Lila Hartwell said quietly. That's what you mean, isn't it? He looked poor, so you assumed he didn't belong. A voice called out from the back of the crowd, older and resonant with authority. I knew Isaiah Reeves. An elderly priest in formal attire pushed through the guests. Father Benedict Morrison's dark skin and white collar commanded immediate respect. I was just a young minister when Isaiah bought this estate. I remember the day he showed me the deed. He was so proud, but also so careful. He knew what it meant for a black man to own property like this in 1954. Father Morrison approached Elijah, studying his face. You have his eyes, son. That same determined kindness. Isaiah used to say, don't mistake gentleness for weakness, Benedict. The strongest thing a man can do is show grace when he has power. Tears were streaming down Elijah's face now, and he didn't bother to hide them. I never knew him. He died before I was born. But you carry his legacy, Father Morrison said. And tonight, you had the chance to demonstrate it. When Mrs. Whitmore humiliated you in front of 200 people, how did you respond? Elijah thought about the rage he'd felt, the embarrassment, the desire to shout back at Adelaide. But he hadn't. Instead, he'd tried to show her his invitation, tried to explain calmly. He responded with grace, Father Morrison said, answering his own question. He turned to address the crowd. Isaiah would be proud. Not because his great-grandson owns this estate, but because when given the power to strike back, he chose dignity instead. Adelaide sank into the chair she'd been gripping, her designer gown pooling around her like spilled paint. I'm sorry, she whispered. Then louder, forcing herself to look at Elijah. I'm so sorry. I was cruel. I was. I judged you based on. I'm sorry. The apology sounded hollow, forced out by social necessity rather than genuine remorse. But Elijah saw something else in her eyes, genuine fear. She'd built her entire identity on being the mistress of Whitmore Estate, on throwing galas and hosting charity events. And in one night, that identity had been stripped away. Horace cleared his throat. Mr. Reeves, as the legal owner of this property, you have several options. You can, of course, ask Mrs. Whitmore to vacate. You could. No, Elijah said firmly. The crowd stirred with surprise. No, that's not. My great-grandfather let the Whitmores stay because displacement wasn't the answer. I'm not going to undo his kindness just because. He looked at Adelaide, seeing not the cruel woman who'd humiliated him, but a frightened person facing the collapse of everything she knew. Just because someone made a mistake. If you're enjoying this story of dignity, redemption, and unexpected grace, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Rosetta Reeves had been watching from a quiet corner of the ballroom, instructed by Horace to wait until the right moment. Now she stepped forward, her lavender church dress a stark contrast to the designer gowns around her. At 78, she moved slowly but with undeniable dignity. Elijah, she said softly, and her grandson turned, his face crumpling when he saw her. He crossed the ballroom in seconds, wrapping his arms around his grandmother. You knew all this time. I did, baby, Rosetta said, patting his back. My daddy made me promise to honor his arrangement with the Whitmores. He said holding a grudge was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So I let them live here, never asked for rent, never even told them I was Isaiah's daughter. She looked past Elijah to Adelaide, who was being comforted by Cordelia, though even Cordelia seemed to be keeping her distance now. But when Thomas Whitmore died, the trust required disclosure. I thought Adelaide deserved to know. And I thought you deserved to know, Elijah. You deserved to understand where you came from. But why send me here tonight? Elijah asked. Why let her humiliate me? Rosetta's eyes grew sad but firm. Because you needed to feel it, baby. You needed to understand what your great-grandfather faced every single day. The assumptions, the judgments, the way people looked at him and decided he wasn't worthy before he ever opened his mouth. And you needed to choose how to respond. She turned to the crowd, her voice carrying despite its softness. My father Isaiah faced this kind of prejudice his whole life. But he never let it make him bitter. When the Whitmores needed help, he gave it. When he had power over them, he chose mercy. That's the legacy I wanted Elijah to understand. Not the estate, not the money, the character. Father Morrison nodded approvingly. Isaiah used to tell me, the measure of a man isn't what he does when everyone's watching with approval. It's what he does when he has every right to be angry, every reason to seek revenge, and he chooses grace anyway. Adelaide had composed herself somewhat, though her makeup was ruined and her reputation was in tatters. Social media notifications were already chiming around the ballroom as videos of the confrontation went viral. By morning, the story would be everywhere. Wealthy socialite tries to remove estate's actual owner. She approached Elijah and Rosetta on unsteady heels. Up close, she looked older, more fragile. The imperious mask had cracked, revealing someone deeply afraid. "Mrs. Reeves," she said to Rosetta, her voice shaking. "I didn't know. Thomas never. I didn't know we'd been living in your family's home all these years." "My father wanted it that way," Rosetta said neutrally. "He thought it was kinder. And I repaid that kindness by—" Adelaide's voice broke. She looked at Elijah. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. I saw your clothes, your bicycle, and I just assumed. I made terrible assumptions." "Yes," Elijah said simply. "You did." The bluntness seemed to surprise Adelaide more than anger would have. She nodded slowly. "I understand if you want me to leave. This is your home. It's always been your home." Elijah looked around the grand ballroom, the crystal chandeliers, the marble floors, the gold trim on the walls. It was beautiful, impressive, everything the tiny apartment in Riverside wasn't. But it felt hollow, like a museum dedicated to excess. "I don't want you to leave," he said finally. "But things can't stay the same either." Horace Pemberton stepped forward, his lawyer's mind already working. "What did you have in mind, Mr. Reeves?" Over the next hour, as the shocked gala guests gradually filtered out, though many stayed, too fascinated by the unfolding drama to leave, Elijah, Rosetta, Horace, and eventually Adelaide hammered out an agreement. The estate would be converted partially into the Reeves Whitmore Community Foundation headquarters. The East Wing, with its dozen unused bedrooms, would become a community center offering after-school programs, tutoring, and mentorship for underprivileged youth. The library would be open to the public. The grounds would host weekend programs teaching life skills, financial literacy, and entrepreneurship. "My great-grandfather was an entrepreneur," Elijah explained, his voice gaining confidence as he outlined his vision. He understood that poverty isn't just about money, it's about access, opportunity, knowledge. He would want this place to be used for that. Adelaide listened, her face unreadable. Finally, she said, "And what about me? Do I just live here while you run this foundation around me?" "You could leave," Elijah said honestly. "Or you could help. You know these social circles, you know how to fundraise, how to organize events. Those are valuable skills. You want me to help run a charity for poor kids?" Adelaide's voice held a trace of her old disdain, but it was weaker now, more questioning than mocking. "I want you to understand why it matters," Elijah corrected. "I want you to meet the kids who need this. I want you to see that the assumptions you made about me tonight, you make about thousands of kids every day without even realizing it." Cordelia Westbrook, who'd been listening from nearby, spoke up. "Adelaide, he's offering you a chance at redemption. After tonight's videos go viral, you're going to need it." Adelaide flinched but nodded. "I suppose I am." She looked at Elijah with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You're more generous than I deserve." "Probably," Elijah agreed. "But my great-grandfather believed in giving people chances. I guess I inherited that." The gala had been meant to end at midnight. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the last guests finally left, though they departed with far more to talk about than they'd anticipated. Natasha Chin had conducted impromptu interviews, already crafting the story that would run in tomorrow's Herald. Elijah stood on the estate's front steps with Rosetta, watching the last luxury cars pull away. His old bicycle still leaned against the marble fountain, absurdly out of place among the manicured gardens. "You did good tonight, baby," Rosetta said, squeezing his hand. "Your great-grandfather would be so proud." "I was scared," Elijah admitted. "When she knocked that glass out of my hand, when everyone was staring. I wanted to run. But you didn't. You stood there with dignity. That's the Reeves legacy, not this estate, not money. Dignity." They walked back inside, through the grand foyer where Adelaide sat alone on a velvet settee, still in her emerald gown, staring at nothing. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rosetta said gently, "it's late. Why don't you go to bed? Tomorrow's going to be a difficult day." Adelaide looked up, her eyes red. "Tomorrow everyone will know what I did. What I am. Tomorrow everyone will know you made a mistake," Rosetta corrected. "What you are is up to you from here on out. My father used to say, people don't remember your worst moment unless you keep repeating it." After Adelaide had drifted upstairs like a ghost, Horace gathered the final documents. "I'll have the official papers drawn up this week. The foundation structure, the shared responsibilities, everything in writing." "Thank you," Elijah said. "For stopping it. For telling the truth." "I was just doing my job," Horace replied. But his eyes twinkled. "Though I'll admit, I've been waiting to see Adelaide Whitmore taken down a peg for about 20 years. The woman once told me my shoes were distressingly bourgeois." Despite everything, Elijah laughed. It felt good, releasing some of the tension that had knotted his shoulders all night. Rosetta called for a car to take them home. No way was Elijah riding his bicycle back at 2 in the morning, but before they left, she led him to a portrait that hung in the estate's main gallery. Elijah had walked past it earlier without really seeing it. The man in the painting was perhaps 40 years old, wearing a brown suit from the 1950s and a fedora. His skin was a rich dark brown, his eyes warm but determined, his mustache neatly trimmed. He looked strong, capable, and kind. "Isaiah Reeves," Rosetta said. "My father. Your great-grandfather." Elijah stared at the portrait, seeing traces of his own face in those features. The same eyes, the same determined set to the jaw. He looks proud. He was not arrogant, but proud of what he'd built, proud of helping people, proud of conducting himself with dignity no matter how people treated him. Rosetta pulled a folded photograph from her purse, showing it to Elijah. "This is him on the day he bought this estate." In the black and white photo, Isaiah stood in front of the Whitmore estate's gates, holding up the deed. His smile was enormous, genuine. But there was something else in his expression: relief, triumph, vindication. He'd been told no 1,000 times, Rosetta explained. Banks wouldn't give him loans. Sellers wouldn't consider his offers. Real estate agents wouldn't show him properties. But he persisted. And when the Whitmores needed help, he had the resources and the grace to provide it. "Why?" Elijah asked. "Why help people who probably wouldn't have helped him?" Because, Rosetta said simply, he was a better man than they were. And he knew that bitterness would poison everything he'd built. He wanted to leave a legacy of possibility, not resentment. Elijah thought about Adelaide's face when she'd tried to have him removed. The disgust, the automatic assumption of his unworthiness. His great-grandfather had faced that every day, probably worse, and had somehow remained generous enough to help those who looked down on him. "I don't know if I can be that good," Elijah whispered. "You already are," Rosetta assured him. "You had every right to have her evicted tonight. To make a scene, to humiliate her the way she humiliated you. But you chose grace. That's Isaiah's legacy living in you." The next 6 months transformed the Whitmore estate in ways no one could have predicted. True to his word, Elijah converted the East Wing into a state-of-the-art community center. The Reeves Whitmore Community Foundation, funded by a combination of the estate's investments, donations, and grants, opened its doors in January. Elijah himself started college, studying business administration and nonprofit management at State University. But he returned to the estate every weekend to run programs, mentor kids, and oversee operations. Adelaide, surprisingly, kept her word. The viral videos of that night's confrontation had indeed destroyed her social standing. 3 of her charity boards asked her to resign. Former friends stopped returning her calls. Cordelia Westbrook had distanced herself completely. But Adelaide showed up at the community center the first day it opened. She taught etiquette classes, not the stuffy kind about which fork to use, but practical skills about professional communication, job interviews, networking. She leveraged her remaining connections to bring in guest speakers, secure internships for students, open doors that would have remained closed. "I'm not doing this for redemption," she told Elijah one afternoon as they reviewed the center's budget. Her designer gowns had been replaced with practical business attire, her imperious manner with something more subdued. "I'm doing it because I finally understand what I didn't see before. These kids aren't different from me, they just didn't start with what I had." "That's exactly what my great-grandfather believed," Elijah said. The community center served over 300 kids in its first 6 months. Marcus Thompson, a 16-year-old from the East Side, got an internship at a tech company through Adelaide's connections. Keisha Williams, a senior who'd been accepted to 3 colleges but couldn't afford any of them, received a full Reeves Foundation scholarship. Dozens of students improved their grades, learned new skills, discovered opportunities they'd never known existed. On a warm Saturday in June, the foundation held a celebration event. The estate grounds were filled not with wealthy socialites in evening gowns, but with families from the surrounding neighborhoods. Children played on the lawns. Teenagers showed off projects they'd completed. Parents thanked Elijah, Rosetta, and even Adelaide for changing their children's lives. Father Benedict Morrison blessed the gathering. Isaiah Reeves once told me that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched, opportunities created, and grace extended. Looking around today, I see the wealth he created. And I see his great-grandson multiplying it. James Kensington, the security guard who'd nearly removed Elijah that first night, now worked as the center's facilities manager. "Best decision I ever made," he told Elijah. "That night taught me something. I was just following orders, but that's what everyone says, isn't it? Now I make sure the orders I follow are worth following." Natasha Chen's article about the Gala incident had indeed gone viral, sparking national conversations about class, prejudice, and assumptions. She'd written a follow-up piece about the foundation's work that attracted even more attention. Donations poured in from across the country. But for Elijah, the most meaningful moment came when a 13-year-old boy named Devin approached him shyly after a mentorship session. "Mr. Reeves?" Devin wore clothes that were too big, probably hand-me-downs, and sneakers that were falling apart. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That night at the gala, when that lady tried to kick you out, were you scared?" Elijah thought about lying, about presenting himself as fearlessly confident. But that wouldn't help Devin, who clearly saw something of himself in Elijah's story. Terrified, Elijah admitted, "I wanted to disappear. I felt like I didn't belong there." "But you did belong there. It was your house." "Legally, yes. But that's not what you're really asking, is it? You want to know if I felt like I belonged there, in my heart." Devin nodded. "No," Elijah said honestly. "I felt exactly like what Mrs. Whitmore saw, a poor kid who'd wandered into the wrong place. But here's what I learned that night: belonging isn't something other people can give you or take away. It's something you claim for yourself. I belonged there not because of the deed in some lawyer's briefcase, but because my great-grandfather built something worth honoring, and I was there to honor it." "What if you don't have a great-grandfather who built something?" Devin asked quietly. "Then you build it yourself. That's what Isaiah did. He didn't inherit wealth, he created it. He didn't wait for permission to be somebody, he just became somebody. And then he used what he'd built to help others. That's what this place is for, Devin. To help you build something." Devin's eyes were bright. "I want to be like you when I grow up." "No," Elijah said gently. "Be like you, but with more resources and opportunities. Be Devin, but the version of Devin who got the chances he deserved. That's what my great-grandfather would want." If you've made it this far, you're part of something special. This story is about more than one night at a gala. It's about how we see each other, how we judge each other, and how we can choose grace over bitterness. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe for more stories about dignity, redemption, and the power of choosing kindness. Your support helps us create content that matters. 1 year after that fateful night, the Reeves Whitmore Community Foundation held its first annual scholarship gala. The event was held at the estate, but this time, the guest list looked very different. Scholarship recipients and their families filled the ballroom alongside donors and community partners. Elijah, now 18 and finishing his freshman year of college, gave the keynote speech. He stood at the same spot where Adelaide had knocked the champagne glass from his hand, where he'd been publicly humiliated, where his life had changed forever. A year ago, he began. I stood in this room wearing my grandfather's old suit, feeling like I didn't belong. Someone looked at me and saw a poor kid who'd crashed a fancy party. She saw my clothes, my bicycle, my obvious poverty, and decided I was worthless. In the audience, Adelaide sat with her head bowed, but she was there. She'd shown up for every foundation event over the past year, slowly rebuilding her reputation not through social connections, but through genuine service. But here's what she didn't see, Elijah continued. She didn't see that I'd worked a closing shift the night before. She didn't see that I helped my grandmother pay bills. She didn't see that I'd been accepted to 3 colleges, but chose state because it was affordable. She didn't see my character, my work ethic, or my dreams. She just saw what I didn't have. He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd, kids from the community center, families he'd come to know, volunteers who'd given their time. I learned something that night. When people look at you and only see what you lack, that says more about them than it does about you. My great-grandfather Isaiah understood that. He faced prejudice and discrimination his whole life, but he never let other people's blindness become his limitation. He built something anyway. He succeeded anyway. He helped people anyway. Elijah's voice grew stronger. This foundation exists because Isaiah Reeves decided 70 years ago that bitterness was a poison and grace was a power. He could have been angry at the Whitmores for their privilege. He could have resented the system that made it hard for him to succeed. Instead, he built success anyway and used it to help others, including the very people who might have looked down on him. He pulled the original crumpled invitation from his pocket. He'd kept it all year, framed alongside Isaiah's portrait. This invitation said I was the guest of honor. At the time, I didn't understand why. I thought there'd been a mistake. But now I understand. I wasn't the guest of honor because I owned the estate. I was the guest of honor because I carried Isaiah's legacy, a legacy of dignity, perseverance, and grace. His eyes found Adelaide in the crowd. And that legacy taught me that people can change. That mistakes don't have to define us. That even when someone treats us terribly, we can choose to offer them a chance to be better. Not because they deserve it, but because that's who we choose to be. Adelaide's eyes were wet, but she smiled a real smile, not the brittle social smile she'd worn that first night. So tonight, Elijah concluded, we celebrate 23 students receiving Reeves Foundation scholarships. We celebrate a community center that served over 500 kids. We celebrate partnerships with local schools, businesses, and organizations. But most of all, we celebrate the idea that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. That being poor doesn't mean being worthless. That dignity isn't something you can buy. It's something you carry inside yourself, no matter what anyone else thinks. The ballroom erupted in applause. Rosetta, sitting in the front row in another lavender dress with her gold cross necklace, wiped tears from behind her glasses. Father Benedict Morrison stood and applauded loudly. Even James Kensington, standing at his post by the door, clapped with obvious pride. After the speeches, after the scholarships were awarded, after the formal program ended and the celebration began, Elijah found himself standing in front of Isaiah's portrait again. The painting had been moved to a place of honor in the community center's main hall, where every student who entered would see it. Adelaide approached quietly. Over the past year, she lost that imperious edge, that assumption of superiority. She looked softer somehow, more human. I think about that night constantly, she said without preamble. I see your face when I knocked that glass from your hand. I hear my own voice saying those terrible things. And I wonder who I was to be so cruel to a child. You were someone who'd never questioned their assumptions, Elijah said. Someone who'd never had to. That's generous. Most people would say I was just a terrible person. Maybe you were, that night. But you're not anymore. That's what matters. Adelaide studied Isaiah's portrait. Do you think he would have forgiven me? If he'd been there that night? Elijah considered the question seriously. I think he would have been disappointed. But yes, I think he would have forgiven you. Forgiveness was kind of his thing. Must have been nice, Being that secure in yourself. I don't think it was security, Elijah said thoughtfully. I think it was a choice. He chose to believe in people's capacity to change. He chose to extend grace even when it wasn't earned. He chose to build bridges instead of walls. And you're choosing the same thing. I'm trying. Some days it's harder than others. Adelaide nodded. For what it's worth, working with these kids over the past year, it's changed me. I see now what I couldn't see before. They're not per kids or charity cases or people who need saving. They're just kids who deserve the same chances I had. That's exactly right, Elijah said. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking at Isaiah's portrait. Behind them, the celebration continued: laughter, music, the sound of a community coming together. Your great-grandfather built something remarkable, Adelaide said finally. Not this estate, though it's beautiful. He built a legacy of grace. And you're multiplying it. We're multiplying it, Elijah corrected. You, me, Grandma, Father Morrison, James, all the volunteers and donors and staff. That's what Isaiah understood. Real change happens when people work together. Devin, the 13-year-old boy who'd asked Elijah about being scared, bounded up to them. He was wearing a new suit, one that actually fit, purchased with funds from the Foundation's clothing program. Mr. Reeves, Ms. Whitmore, come meet my mom. She wants to thank you both for my scholarship. As they followed Devin into the crowd, Elijah caught his grandmother's eye across the room. She smiled and nodded, that same knowing smile she'd given him the morning of the gala. She'd known, he realized. She'd known he would face humiliation and choose grace. She'd known Adelaide would reveal her true character and then have the opportunity to change it. She'd known that sometimes the most powerful gift you can give someone is the chance to discover who they really are and who they can choose to become. The Whitmore estate, now the Reeves Whitmore Community Foundation headquarters, stood as a testament to multiple legacies. Isaiah's legacy of building something from nothing and using it to help others. Rosetta's legacy of honoring promises and believing in redemption. Elijah's legacy of choosing dignity over bitterness, even when bitterness would have been justified. And yes, even Adelaide's legacy, not the legacy of privilege and prejudice she'd originally embodied, but the new legacy she was building through service, humility, and genuine change. Outside, Elijah's old bicycle still sat in storage, a reminder of where he'd come from. But next to it now sat dozens of bicycles donated through the Foundation's transportation program, helping kids get to school and jobs and opportunities. That night, after the last guests had left and the estate had quieted, Elijah stood on the front steps where he'd once parked his bicycle among the luxury cars. The fountain still burbled peacefully. The manicured gardens still glowed under strategic lighting. But it felt different now. It felt like home. Not because it belonged to him legally, though it did, but because it was finally being used for the purpose Isaiah had always intended, as a place where dignity, opportunity, and grace could flourish. His phone buzzed with a text from Devin. "Thank you for believing in me. I won't let you down." Elijah smiled and typed back, "You couldn't let me down if you tried. Just be yourself and keep working hard. That's all anyone can ask." As he sent the message, he thought about that terrifying moment when Adelaide had confronted him, when the entire ballroom had stared at him, when he'd felt smaller and more worthless than he'd ever felt in his life. That moment had been a test, not of his ownership or his rights, but of his character. And in choosing to respond with dignity rather than anger, with grace rather than revenge, with redemption rather than retribution, he'd proven himself worthy of Isaiah's legacy. Not because he was perfect. Not because he always knew what to do. But because when it mattered most, when he had every reason to strike back, he'd chosen the harder, better path. The path of grace. And in doing so, he changed not just his own life, but Adelaide's and the lives of hundreds of kids who would pass through the Foundation's doors in the years to come. Isaiah Reeves would have been proud. But more importantly, Elijah Reeves was learning to be proud of himself, not for what he owned or what he'd inherited, but for who he was choosing to become. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy of all. If this story of grace, dignity, and second chances moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of our shared humanity. Drop a comment below telling us, have you ever been judged unfairly? Or have you been the one who made assumptions about someone else? Share your story. This community is built on honest conversations and growth. And if you believe in the power of redemption like Elijah and Isaiah did, smash that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Remember, we all have the power to choose grace over bitterness, dignity over revenge, and redemption over condemnation. See you in the next story, and until then, choose grace.